Mand Modality Preference Assessment is a preference assessment that's geared towards identifying the preferred communication modality. With any preference assessment, like a tangible preference assessment, there are a variety of formats that you can use for this. With all of them, we're going to be measuring response allocation towards a specific modality. You can really use a Mand Modality Preference Assessment to identify a preferred modality to use within the context of skill acquisition programming, but we use it in our lab and our department within the context of functional communication training. So the goal there is to identify a preferred modality to replace challenging behavior.
You can use it just to identify, inform caregiver alignment. So if the individual or the child's preferred modality is also the caregiver's preferred modality, then that's great. That's phenomenal. But if the caregiver's preferred modality is a child's least preferred modality, I think you're going to have to navigate that a little differently.
Within the bigger picture of social validity and assent, I think it's such a small, easy way, relatively speaking, to incorporate choice. And there's so many other ways that we can do it within just looking at functional communication training. We can look at things like, the effort it takes to complete a task within escape treatment, the types of attention, who's conducting it. There's so many things that we can tweak that with assent and autonomy for the individual we're working with in mind.
Hey, really quick, before we start, Cooperant Learning is a project of Sparks Behavioral Services, LLC, an ACE-approved continuing education provider for BCBAs. If you'd like to get continuing education credits for this or many of our other episodes, check out cooperantlearning.com. There you're going to look for the episode, complete a short quiz about the content discussed, and a certificate will be given to you right there in your dashboard. You can also sign up for our email list for updates on the latest episodes, coupon codes, and courses we offer. And of course, follow us on social media like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, the whole 9 yards. Okay. That's all. Enjoy the episode. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Cooperant Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Steary. With us as always, is Dr. Steve Sparks. Not Steven, as we've just discussed. Dr. Steve.
I think Dr. Steven is fine. Either way, the whole just Dr. first name, I feel like a kid's dentist. So I usually just either Steve or Dr. Sparks, whatever you want to do. You know what I mean? But
there is a Simpsons episode where they go to the chiropractor and there's 10 chiropractors and they're all named Dr. Steve. And I don't even know why that's funny, but I find it funny. But how are you doing? We're on our way to BAM here pretty soon,
Yep.
Behavior Analysis Association of Michigan.
Excited
tomorrow.
to give away some free stuff tomorrow. Talk to people, maybe even see if we can record something while at our table. We're going to try some new technology out. So it'll be fun.
Cool. I didn't know that, so that's fun.
I asked if you wanted to do that, and you said, we'll see if it works. And to me, that means we're going to test it out.
To me, that means maybe we don't have to talk about it, but we'll figure it out.
So yeah, that'll be fun. Just ready for some of the best pizza around. There's a tikka masala pizza from a place in town there that is just amazing. So I'm looking forward to it.
If for nothing else, that pizza was amazing.
Yeah.
But hey, we're not here to talk too much about pizza.
This isn't the food review episode?
No, it's not. Not today. Let me introduce our guests. We have some amazing guests today. Assistant professor, board certified behavior analyst in the specialized behavioral intervention department at the University of Nebraska Medical Center's Monroe-Meyer Institute, whose clinical and research work focuses on the assessment and treatment of severe challenging behavior using a scientist practitioner model. Her research emphasizes the application of functional analysis to inform individualized intervention, with a particular interest in optimizing functional communication training and examination of Mand Modality Preference Assessments, our topic of the day. Dr. Cynthia Livingston, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Let me introduce your partner here, another board-certified behavior analyst working in the Specialized Behavior Intervention Department at Monroe-Meyer as well. She specializes in assessing and treating challenging behavior in individuals diagnosed with autism and other developmental disabilities with clinical and research interest also in FCT and, again, our topic of the day, Mand Modality Preference Assessments. Alexandra Cicero, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thanks so much for having us.
If I missed anything in those introductions, tell us how things are going out in Nebraska.
Things are going great in Nebraska. I know the rest of the country is really cold right now, but we've had 60-degree weather, so we're kind of thriving over here.
Yeah, that's always it's the Midwest, or what do we call it? The pretend spring, or the
false spring. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're supposed to have hit 60 today, but it's already dropped down to 42 and might be snowing by Sunday. So
I think it's supposed to snow here tomorrow.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, never
Not for
never get too
long.
excited.
Yeah.
Well, it's really a pleasure to have you both here joining us, talking to everybody today. Like I said, our topic is Mand Modality Preference Assessments. Your research and work focuses a lot on this topic, so it's great to have you to discuss this with us. I thought we'd just start off by kind of landing on a working definition of what these Mand Modality Preference Assessments are, and maybe differentiate, is it Mand Modality Preference Assessment, Mand Topography Assessment? I've seen them both, maybe interchangeably, I'm not sure. But so yeah, whoever wants to go first, telling us all about those.
Yeah. So simply put, a Mand Modality Preference Assessment is a preference assessment that's geared towards identifying the preferred communication modality. With any preference assessment, like a tangible preference assessment, there are a variety of formats that you can use for this. With all of them, we're going to be measuring response allocation towards a specific modality. You can really use a Mand Modality Preference Assessment to identify a preferred modality to use within the context of skill acquisition programming, but we use it in our lab and our department within the context of functional communication training. So the goal there is to identify a preferred modality to replace challenging behavior. We use kind of two formats, usually a free operant or an MSWO format. And Alex,
Yeah.
I think you can describe those.
Yeah, definitely. So the free operant format, it's more like all the modalities are concurrently available, and anytime the individual allocates or omits one of the modalities, then reinforcement is provided, specifically that functional reinforcer. Whereas for an MSWO format, we're typically having all modalities in front of the individual, and then following the omission of one FCR, that modality is then removed from the array, and that's more of a trial-based format.
And I can
Gotcha.
conceptualize. Oh, sorry.
No,
I
you're
think I
fine.
conceptualize the Mand topography assessment as
Yeah.
that was kind of what we started calling it. You can see that in one of the first kind of Mand modality preference assessments or assessments with Ringdahl 2008. They used Mand topography assessment, and we've seen the shift more towards calling it a Mand modality preference assessment whenever we're identifying preference. Before, when people were conducting the Mand topography assessment, they were also looking at things like proficiency and other variables that might influence responding. So I think Mand topography assessment is more an umbrella term, and then Mand modality preference assessment kind of falls within that.
Gotcha. Okay. So setting the record straight, we're calling them MMPAs.
It's a nice one.
I'm curious. Yeah, I'm always curious. Was there a particular event, maybe a interaction with a consumer, or some sort of period of time in your learning history in which that really sparked your interest? Like, hey, this is something I really want to pursue and understand more.
Yeah, definitely. This whole research line really started from clinical need. I had a patient maybe 4 or 5 years ago. He's around 7 years old. We'll call him Eric. He came in with some vocalizations, a history of using gestures and picture exchange to communicate, and he also had access to a speech generating device. And we ran our functional analysis. I think we identified multiply maintained challenging behavior, and we asked caregivers, how would you like for us, or which of the modalities would you like for us to target within functional communication training? And they said, let him choose. But Eric, he didn't have the communication repertoire to be able, we couldn't just ask him and say, which one do you want to use? And that's where we went back to literature, found the Ringdahl et al. 2008 proficiency assessment. When Born and Kemmer, I think 2009, they had that kind of first iteration of a Mand modality preference assessment and kind of started going down the MMPA rabbit hole.
So this is probably something you may get into anyways, but so if you're holding off on a later question, that's fine too. But do you find this to be most helpful with people with some limited verbal behavior, or is this something that you use with any consumer regardless of who you're working with?
It's a good question. I would say primarily we're using it for children who need some type of augmented assistant communication, so an AAC of some sort. We have used it with children who are vocal, and it's usually within the context of times in which a child, although they have the skill set to be vocal, they're having difficulty vocalizing in an appropriate way. They're yelling out things, or they're saying the FCR, the functional communication response, but it's yelling it. And so it allows us to identify another alternative that we would use typically in combination with the vocalization.
Yeah, I was just thinking from our perspective, we do the same kind of work it sounds like that you all are doing, except many times with adults, and a lot of times it's not someone with a developmental disability, but a mental health diagnosis as well. And so,
Mhm.
just trying to think, would there be a functionality to this if we had, say someone who um, was an adult with a schizophrenia diagnosis and was having active delusions? I bet we could find a way to use it, but it would just kind of be a reworking of that same kind of design.
Mhm. And also, when we're talking about Mand Modality Preference Assessments within the context of functional communication training, we're really just looking for one modality to replace challenging behavior. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that once we find the most preferred, that's their communication repertoire, that specific modality. And it can just be, you might end up with a modality that differs from the one that they use for other forms of communication, but they prefer it as the replacement for challenging behavior.
So this isn't necessarily something that's brand new, but in the grand scheme of, FCT has been around for a few decades now. When do we see this kind of consumer choice in the modality in which FCT is trained and how they utilize it? When does that kind of enter the picture in the evolution of FCT?
Yeah, Alex and I were talking about this. We can find some articles that have something related to it's a systematic approach to identifying some type of modality to include in functional communication training. But I think the first really iteration of a preference assessment of this kind is the Winborn and Kemmerer et al. 2009
Okay.
article where they identified two modalities, a high preferred and a low preferred, and compared them to see if the outcomes of FCT would differ.
Really, really cool. Giving just think of how powerful FCT is already, and now this kind of, and we're going to talk about autonomy later on and everything, but just giving folks some even more self-determination in what these setups look like and how these interventions look. It's a really, really cool topic. So I thought we would maybe go over some of your research that you sent me some really, really great articles. The comparison of Mand acquisition and preference in children with autism who exhibit problem behaviors, Livingston et al. 2024. What was the research question with this article, and how did you go about as far as your methods go, and what were your findings there?
Yeah, so this actually goes back to Eric and his family. So once we identified a preferred modality for him, I think it was speech generating device. I thought it would be really cool to do this with all my other clients. We're promoting choice, autonomy, and so we ran it with maybe 4 or 5 of my cases, and we started to wonder what was actually influencing preference. So with Eric, he came in with it's somewhat of an extensive communication repertoire. He wasn't always using it, but he had experience with it. And I wondered if some prior exposure or even just how we taught the different modalities to proficiency, if that might have influenced preference. So I was kind of worried that maybe there was a modality that we had just taught and then we ran the MMPA, that maybe because there was a recency effect or a modality that had more training trials and more reinforcement trials, there would be some correlation between that modality and a preferred modality. And ultimately, we really didn't see much of consistent correlations between the number of trials or the order in which we taught each of the modalities and the child's preferred modality.
Gotcha. So, so proficiency, if I'm hearing that correctly, proficiency going into the trials didn't necessarily influence choice later on.
Not in this study. I don't know that I'm ready
Okay.
to say for sure that it doesn't influence, because I do think proficiency, if you don't know how to use something, you're not going to use it very often. But I think there needs to be some level of proficiency, but it doesn't seem to be influencing preference, at least in this study.
Gotcha. And it kind of ties into a question I had later on, but maybe now's a better time to ask it. What would you do if there was a preference for a Mand modality that maybe the consumer wasn't necessarily proficient in, or as proficient as another Mand modality? So, for example, if I am somewhat proficient in like an AAC device, but I'm more proficient in, manual sign or something like that, but I prefer the AAC device. Is there kind of a task analysis for navigating that situation? Is it just teaching that skill more since it's preferred?
I would say most of the time I'm going to recommend including multiple modalities, at least to start. So if you have a kid that seems to, I don't always see that if they're not able to use it, they still prefer it. But I have seen kids, for example, with the speech generating device, they use it and they use it well, but they're also stimming on it, or they're they want the auditory feedback. And so they're kind of pushing, so it's a lot of incorrect responding, but they seem to really prefer it. And that might be a case where we're also promoting another modality. And usually I'm picking one without correlated stimuli, just so that we don't have to worry about if the iPad's gone, they now have, something that doesn't come with things. But so I usually would recommend teaching another one, and then also trying to clean up the proficiency. So whether it be kind of promoting, not reinforcing when it's incorrectly used, or doing more booster training.
Are you seeing, across individuals any patterns with what is preferred? And I'm kind of thinking in terms of, okay, a lot of people, once we see them as adults, they've had some form of communication training, and either it's preferred because they've learned it's helpful in the past and that it's stopped being used, or no, this is aversive because I hated that training process that wasn't done well and previously, and so now that is the least preferred, that sort of thing.
It's funny you asked. We're actually working on a retrospective analysis of all of the MMPAs that have been conducted in our department to figure that out. I'd like to know, are we seeing these common patterns? There was a study, a literature review, I think published in 2022, 23. It's O'Brien et al. They did a literature review of high and low tech, or Mand Modality Preference Assessments that compared high and low tech. And I believe that there were more the high tech was more preferred across the studies that they looked at. They didn't look at Mand Modality Preference Assessments that didn't have a high tech and a low tech. So if you had gestures, vocal, and picture exchange, that would have been excluded from their review. But I think it's likely that we'll see some similarities. But in general, I would say all the studies that we published on Mand Modality Preference Assessments, we've never had a case where all participants preferred the same modality.
Interesting. Yeah, I know I've started going, and again, we're working usually in adult foster care homes and with staff that are less trained and a lot of turnover. And so I've simplified a picture exchange system where it is just kind of in situ, but we still will find people who find it aversive because of some past training, some past history. And oftentimes signs or gestures are preferred, but then as new staff are filtering in, they're not learning those quickly enough for it to be effective. So it's more of a transfer of training and an in situ teaching rather than trying to do actual going through trials, because it's the trial-based learning that has become so aversive to them much of the time.
Yeah, definitely.
It is always wild to the learning histories with older consumers. We trained a PECS system to an individual, this was last year, who had no functional MANs as far as we knew. And we had probed a little bit and tried, and we couldn't really get much other than just like running to the refrigerator was a clear MAN for the food. So we tried to replace that with a PECS system. But once this individual became more proficient with PECS and getting those reinforcers from the refrigerator with a PECS exchange, suddenly we saw some manual signs come out, and we didn't even know those existed. We saw this, and we saw like a please sign. So it was just really interesting. And there's so many different just systems that people go through sometimes that you're just not aware of or don't see. So
we're working on a study. We're writing it up right now, looking at what happens after we do I know we're going to talk about sequential extinction, but essentially a variation of our Mand Modality Preference Assessment, and then assessing preference afterwards to see if there's any changes. And what we've seen is that there have been changes in preferences, and throughout the course of functional communication training treatment, so in schedule thinning, treatment challenges, we sometimes will see a kid just, it's seemingly random. I'm sure it's not actually random, but they'll just switch over to a modality that we have all these data to show they didn't prefer it. And I think a lot of it comes down to we don't have a full grasp of all the contexts in which a child is going to prefer a modality, and we really shouldn't take the Mand Modality Preference Assessment and assume like, okay, we're done, that's what they like. We should
Right.
continue to assess within context and throughout the course of an intervention too.
Sure.
Do you,
Sure.
do you think there's any interplay with, the research that shows just the opportunity to make a choice, decreasing the aversive condition or making it more reinforcing to choose maybe something that wouldn't normally be the choice?
Yeah, definitely. There's also research within functional communication training showing that if you include multiple modalities, that it you're going to get potentially better functional communication outcomes, which I think goes hand in hand too with assent. Like if you provide the choices, kids might be more likely to assent to something than if you just say, this is what we're going to do no matter what.
Yeah, I include this in my email. This is the picture that kept coming to my head while I was reading this research was being at the store. I'm such a big candy bar fan. I love Snickers bars, and having like cash in my wallet or checkbook or tap pay, all three functionally could equal that candy bar, as a reinforcer. But I'll be in my cold grave before I'm gonna be writing a check for a candy
Yeah.
bar, and holding everybody up in the line. So it's interesting even how modalities that are consequated with the same reinforcer can fluctuate and change, and there's preference for one over the other, and those variables that we might not even be aware of might be making one more or less likely.
Yeah, definitely. I think I give the example of also there are people that I would want to call on the phone, and there are people that I would never answer the phone, but I would text them right away. So I think it's also about who's conducting it, who's providing the reinforcer. There's so much that can influence preference outside of what is being reinforced.
Right.
And along that same line, just say if there's something else going on in the background, texting is a lot easier than answering the phone, and so
Yes,
other
yeah,
environmental stimuli probably plays a large role as well.
Some
definitely, yeah.
context. Huh. Well, let's get into the second study. This is comparison of caregivers and children's preference for Mand topography during functional communication training. This is Livingston et al. 2024. Tell us about this study. What were you asking, and what did you ultimately find in this work?
Yeah, it goes back to Eric too. So we'd identified his most preferred modality and went down that treatment. We started schedule thinning with treatment challenges, and we made really good progress using his most preferred modality. And his parents said during one of our caregiver training meetings, they said, "Hey, we actually want to start focusing on vocal. We don't want to use speech generating device anymore." And I thought, dang, I've run all these Mand Modality Preference Assessments in my department with all my cases, and I don't think I put as much thought into the parents' preference as I did into the child's preference. And so that's where we kind of took a step back and said, before we figure out what's influencing preference, let's see, is Eric's family that you know, an outlier, or are we seeing these differences in preferences between what parents want for their kids and what kids want for themselves and how they communicate? And then we found that generally speaking, I think we had one partial match, but everybody, they did not match. So parents and caregivers and children, they did not have the same preferences, which no one's surprised by. I prefer to text my parents. They prefer to call me. It's kind of funny that we kind of went into it thinking like maybe there will be some alignments, but that's not what we saw.
Yeah, I had to laugh because I've got one teenager and then a couple younger, and yeah, our preferences rarely align.
Yeah,
So yeah. So what does that mean them in terms of, and I had emailed you about this too. We do navigate this in a different light, but similar in the all of our consumers by law have person-centered plans, self-determination. They get to decide, what their plans look like, and what kind of behavioral treatment they get in their behavior plans, who works with them, all these things. And often in these meetings, guardian and consumer preferences or choices do not align. So, one might say, I don't want this in my behavior plan. The guardian says I do. And now we're kind of stuck towing that line of, social validity, getting effective treatment, but making everybody happy and still honoring recipient rights. It's a really complex thing really quick. So with the parents in the study, how did you guys navigate that, and after their preference assessment with the interviews with the parents?
Yeah, good question. I'll start by saying that we start by having a conversation, but Alex is her dissertation is kind of looking at caregiver versus child preferences, and she has a lot more to add to this one.
Yeah,
Alex,
definitely.
take the floor. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is just to start with that conversation and asking caregivers why they prefer one modality over another. Because when we did that, parents would let us know that maybe they don't have the resources for a speech generating device, or they have animals at home so that animals might eat a card exchange. And we could just identify what variables are informing their preference and then go from there. But we typically recommend starting with teaching both the child preferred and the caregiver preferred modalities.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it was our first episode with Cody Morris discussing assent, and I asked the question something like, is there kind of a task analysis? Like, is there a way to just navigate, like when these disagreements come up, is there like a good kind of foolproof task analysis? And he's like, no, not really. It's kind of like a case by case, situation by situation, and which is so true, right? Like there's I would have never thought about that. An animal eating the cards. Who would have thought?
Mhm.
Yeah. By the time we're working with adult populations, usually just like some of the consumers, the guardians, they go, no, what, that picture exchange doesn't work. They tried it before, so we don't want to do that. And so some education on maybe it just wasn't used the right way as well.
Yeah,
Definitely. And I would also, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I also think that it's important to note that preference might shift, like Dr. Livingston had said, in terms of like whether it's a caregiver or child's preference might shift. For example, if the caregivers do prefer that speech generating device, once they see it disrupted with, their preference might shift immediately to something else.
Yeah.
And I would also remind the parents that this is just the replacement response for challenging behavior. We are not talking about the full communication repertoire. If you want to use a speech generating device and your child wants to use gestures, you can still use speech generating device for some other forms of communication as you're going through your verbal behavior programming, when you want to teach other types of MMPAs. But as the replacement for challenging behavior, sometimes that will just result in them saying like, oh, okay, as long as it's not the only way that they're going to communicate, which has been nice.
Gotcha. Oh, Steve, were you going to say something? Sorry.
I was going to say a lot of times just talking about the final goal being to transfer to something like that can encompass the entire repertoire helped a lot as well. But you got to have that first step somewhere first.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that kind of leads into this Mand modality hierarchy. So the evaluation of a sequential extinction procedure on preference for communication modalities during functional communication training. This is 2025 article. This actually sought to use a form of extinction in an MMPA to develop a preference hierarchy for functionally communicative responses. Can you kind of walk us through maybe what the impetus for this was, and then start talking about the methods that you used to do this study?
Yeah, definitely. We came up with this study out of clinical need. So in the last study, when we were talking about caregiver and child preferences, for one of the participants, mom and dad, they also didn't have agreement between their most preferred and their spouse's most preferred. And then mom's most preferred and dad's most preferred didn't match the child's most preferred. So we're in a situation where we knew some people were not going to be happy. Like they're not going to get what they want because there's three people who have different opinions. And so parents were on board to still try to use the child. I think he's Rowan in the study, and they either Rowan or Ray. I have two R names, and so I'm forgetting which one. But so what we did is we wanted to see what would happen if we used the kids' most preferred versus the parents' most preferred or moms versus dads. And we set up an arrangement where we ran our typical MMPA. So all of the modalities are reinforced on an FR1 scheduled reinforcement, and it's reinforced with the functional reinforcer. I think for him it was tangible. And we found his most preferred was speech generating device. And then we placed that modality on extinction, but still reinforced the use of gestures, picture exchange, or vocal. And we just wanted to see, would he switch over? Would there be a big increase in challenging behavior? Or would, because we taught these other modalities, he would just switch over? Like when my parents don't text me back, I call them. I don't,
Yeah.
sometimes I'll throw a fit, but most of the time I'm pretty easy to just pick up the phone and talk to them. And for him, it went really well. Like for him, we actually used response restriction first. So we moved the device across the room. And then for the remaining participants, we placed on extinction, which is sometimes what will happen in the home. If a parent doesn't like a modality, they may not reinforce it. Or if somebody doesn't understand a very idiosyncratic gesture, they may not know to reinforce it.
Right.
And we found most of our kids were pretty flexible. We would see some increases in challenging behavior, but all of them were temporary, and they all ceased. All of it ceased once they switched over to a new modality, which was cool. We saw, I think, now with Alex's dissertation, I'm kind of preliminarily saying that kids are showing to be more flexible at not using their most preferred than parents, which is kind of interesting.
Yep. For my dissertation, it was really neat because most of the child's preferences shifted. However, all 4 caregivers, their preference did not shift like at all throughout, because we assessed it 3 different times. So we assessed it before treatment, during treatment, and after treatment. And at no point did the top preferred modality shift for any of the caregivers.
All I'll say is that tracks.
Yeah.
You said that if there was problem behavior, it was minimal during this. Was that, would you say that was an extinction side effect, or was it just this brief, like, what's going on? And then, oh, I can still do this.
I conceptualize it as almost resurgence. So in a resurgence arrangement, you're seeing when the alternative response is placed on extinction, you might see an increase in challenging behavior. This is a little bit different in that there were other modalities that they could engage in. We always had something available that was reinforced. And so I kind of attribute that to more resurgence. And although we don't want to see challenging behavior, the goal is always behavior reduction. I think that contacting extinction and also that kind of extinction-induced variability of, I tried this, okay, that didn't work, let me try this other thing, really makes them these treatments more durable, because the child has it in their repertoire to try something else before problem behavior now, which is kind of the goal.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense when we see how much scrolling we see when something is put under extinction. If the scrolling is something we've programmed for, something we should probably do in a lot more areas in our field as well.
Yeah. What can a clinician developing, much like a stimulus preference assessment where we develop a hierarchy, how can we utilize the information we get from a Mand modality preference hierarchy?
So I definitely think you can use it just to identify, inform caregiver alignment. So if the individual or the child's preferred modality is also the caregiver's preferred modality, then that's great. That's phenomenal. But if the caregiver's preferred modality is a child's least preferred modality, I think you're going to have to navigate that a little differently than if the child's second most preferred modality is the caregiver's first preferred.
Gotcha. Can you see it as well? I've ran into the situation before where the highly proficient, iPad battery dies or something like that while you're out in public or something like that. And having that knowledge of, hey, this individual has other ways to communicate. And now I know not only what they're good at, but what they prefer to do too, in lieu of this being now placed on extinction.
Definitely. Yeah.
Cool. Kind of like some big picture thoughts here going forward, for clinicians who maybe aren't doing this or unaware of these procedures, who pick one FCR, or even well-intended, having that meeting saying this is probably the best move going forward, but picking one and going with that one. What might we be missing by not conducting this assessment of hierarchy?
Yeah, I think what you just said is so important, that the device might die. And now if you didn't teach multiple modalities or multiple FCRs, now you might end up with an individual who's engaging in challenging behavior in the supermarket. But if you teach another response modality like a gesture, now you might be able to minimize that. also you could end up with an FCR modality that isn't as efficient or durable, or a modality that just isn't as preferred by the child, and it might not work as well as you might have anticipated.
Yeah.
Question on at least the acquisition speed. Are you seeing that because you're having to teach multiple modalities that it slows down or increases the amount of contact with the consumers? And I'm just thinking about our setting versus a lot of other settings where we have maybe an hour or two a week to work with someone rather than in an autism type setting. Not that you wouldn't still do this, but you may hammer one to get it quickly and then try to add in the others later, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that we will have some cases where we either can't teach the modality because of the skill repertoire, or we'll run a proficiency assessment. So that's just to get an idea of, do they have this in their repertoire already? And if they don't, you could potentially just not include that in your modality preference assessment and instead just include the ones they already know how to do. So you don't have to take the time to. A lot of kids that we work with will still go through acquisition and make sure they have it in their repertoire, but we're pretty confident going in that they have vocalizations, or we've talked to their SLP, their speech language pathologist, caregivers, and we kind of know what they know how to use. They may not know that this specific contingency of, if I use this modality, I'm going to get the functional reinforcer, but oftentimes it's already, they know how to exchange a card or, sign for more, things like that. It's a good question.
Have you needed to or had any success with doing kind of a brief assessment to see what is in the repertoire already? And I'm thinking a lot of in terms of some of the places we go to, someone's moved into a new adult care home. The guardians are hired guardians, so we can't really do a family questionnaire, and we don't have access to the other home, and we're going in blind. And so does it seem to be pretty easy or helpful to be able to do a quick assessment to see what's in the repertoire, or do you kind of just have to play with it and see what you find over time?
Yeah. So
Alex, you've done proficiency assessments, so I think,
Yeah. So for my dissertation, before we do anything, we're just starting, once we've identified some different modalities that a caregiver would prefer and just some that might or may not have been in the learner's repertoire, we'll just run a proficiency assessment. And what that's looking like is we'll just have the modality in front of the participant, and then we'll remove that functional reinforcer and see if they engage in the response or not. And then if after 10 trials or 5 trials, the individual is not engaging in it independently, we're just going to move on to the next modality, because we know that that modality is likely not in that learner's repertoire.
Very
and so
cool.
it just gets it. We just run through it pretty fast. It only should take a few minutes when we were running it.
Gotcha. That's really useful. One of the big themes that I see in this as I read is the idea of autonomy and self-determination, in that, granting more choice, as many possible choices as possible to our folks that we work with. And this is doing just that. Do you see this as in line with behavioral assent or as a form of assent in treatment? And how does social validity play into all this? I like to always touch on social validity and autonomy in these conversations.
Yeah, I definitely think that it could be. But like assent is just defined by the individual, so it's not like one shoe fits all. But providing the choices might lead to assent. So it's definitely, I think, a pathway forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It allows the individual to maybe provide that assent or dissent in contexts that they might not have normally been able to, or in a more proficient manner.
Yeah, and they might just the ability to have the choice, and they get to pick the way that they want to communicate, of course, within reason. It might also help with assent.
Awesome. I love the assent. That's good stuff.
Hey, Kyle's all about the social validity. I'm about the hard science. So that's where we come in.
Can they come together?
We get along just fine.
Yeah.
He's like the conscious on my shoulder. You know what I mean? Where he helps me be
I do think
person.
Within the bigger picture of social validity and assent, I think it's such a small easy way, relatively speaking, to incorporate choice. And there's so many other ways that we can do it within just looking at functional communication training. We can look at things like, the effort it takes to complete a task within escape treatment, the types of attention, the who's conducting it. There's so many things that we can tweak that with assent and autonomy for the individual we're working with in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a real good point too, because when you're working with aberrant behavior like that, and it's effective for them, it's maintaining because it's being reinforced, then we are often changing behavior that they don't necessarily want to change if they have the verbal behavior to discuss that, because it is effective for them. And so those little pieces of seeing consent, assent, or just willingness to take up these skills and use them because they're effective, and at least maybe not more reinforcing, but don't have the aversive piece to them as well, I think is a good way to show that assent or consent throughout those processes too.
Yeah, definitely.
Going forward, what I know Alexandra's working on her dissertation, research questions going forward about MMPAs. What questions still remain, and what is your lab working to figure out?
Yeah, I love talking about our next steps. Like I said, we're doing that retrospective analysis where we're looking at all of our MMPAs that have been conducted in our department just to see if there's any common patterns of outcomes. We're obviously Alex's dissertation is looking at more extended look at caregiver preference and the influence of caregiver preference on the effectiveness of FCT. I really want to know more about how setting influences things. A lot of our kids prefer speech generating device, and parents do too. But what happens when you take it to Target and now it's been thrown across the aisle, or it's continuously getting broken, or it's not getting brought in? I want to know too more about the preference of clinicians and speech pathologists, because as a team, we really should be coming together and making decisions. I want to always incorporate caregivers' preferences and be culturally responsive and make sure we're really leaning into what the child and caregiver want, but also talking to our other colleagues and making sure that we're not missing something, or we could expand on a repertoire differently if we went with one modality versus another. I think of other ones. I think looking at when we need to shift preferences, how to do it in a way that limits challenging behavior. If we need to shift caregiver preferences, it limits any issues that we might run into with integrity or adherence to our treatment. So we have a lot of things we want to look at.
Yeah, that's so great. I love talking about what's in the future too, because there's so many cool things that cool directions you can take this. So
definitely,
that's great stuff. Steve, anything I missed or any questions from our audience? We're kind of winded in on our 50 minutes here. If there's anyone in the crowd or in the chat that has a question, Steve, any other questions?
I can always think of something. So as you're working on this, are you seeing any, and this isn't necessarily from the research standpoint as much, but where the problematic or target behavior is still maintaining as these new skills are developing as well, and so you're having to address them kind of like a reactive strategy, or are you putting in caregiver or family interventions as well, so it's not reinforced on that side? And what I'm really thinking is, I usually kind of think of it as a scale. There's the reinforcing value of the outcome of the target behavior versus the appropriate behavior. If the problematic behavior is easier or more effective, then that's going to maintain. And like, kind of how are you all addressing that?
That's a great question. So when we're conducting our Mand Modality Preference Assessment, at least clinically, in most cases, it's always within the context of functional communication training. So that means that while we're reinforcing appropriate communication, so one of the modalities that they use, we're also in most cases placing challenging behavior on extinction, or if we're reinforcing challenging behavior because extinction is unsafe or unfeasible, then we're delivering less of the reinforcer or lower quality of the reinforcer. So shifting a parameter for challenging behavior. And in most cases, when we're running our Mand Modality Preference Assessment, especially without the sequential extinction component, we're seeing like almost full suppression of challenging behavior and then allocation to another modality. In most cases, the preferred modality.
So it is taken over quite quickly then in most cases. Have you seen that this kind of addresses extinction burst as well throughout that process? Because now there's the other alternative available that much more quickly. It doesn't need to be a full, true regular extinction, except for that problematic behavior.
Yes, and in our sequential extinction paper, I think we saw that there was really limited challenging behavior. But when we get into schedule thinning, that's usually where we're programming times where, yes, you ask nicely, but you have to wait or you have to work, and we will still see challenging behavior. And there's some research that I think it's Ringdahl 2018 that looked at when it's a preferred modality, when you have that treatment challenge, if you're going to see differences with a preferred versus a less preferred modality. And they've shown that the outcomes are better in the context of treatment challenges like extinction of the functional communication response. The more preferred modality works better.
Yeah, I know at least by the time someone comes to us as an adult, almost all the target behavior tends to be multiply maintained because it kind of just becomes the bag of tricks.
So
It's
much to do,
effective. Is there any difference between someone that comes in that has, a single function of some of these target behaviors versus multiple functions?
So I've seen in one paper, it's Torelli et al., I think 2012, but they had one participant and they actually looked at Mand Modality Preference Assessments across functions. I think it was escape function and tangible, and they had the same outcomes. Their procedures were a little bit different for their Mand Modality Preference Assessment. It was almost like a multiple stimulus with replacement. And for one case here, we've done an MMPA for tangible attention and also escape. It was mostly maintained problem behavior. Really interestingly, same preference for all modalities, but the pattern of responding was different with the escape, where it was more variable. You'd see switching from preferred modalities versus attention. It was clearly SGD, speech generating device, tangible, clearly speech generating device. So I don't really know for sure how much it would influence, because we haven't really, maybe that's our next area for future research. But I think that you're going to see differences in preferences based on the type of reinforcer for sure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder if it even has to do with how much of a motivating operation, how strong that is in an escape maintain response versus tangible or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of like response effort too, in a situation that's highly aversive. How does response effort versus something that's more of it's good to have, but I don't necessarily need that.
And it's so hard to figure out what is. We can talk all day about what we think is going to be easy or hard for a kid, but I don't know if using a speech generating device is really hard for a kid relative to vocal if the kid is vocal. It's hard to know whether or not, a card exchange is really harder than vocal for some, but maybe for another kid, vocalization is the easiest thing for them to use. Yeah, so it's really hard to figure that out.
It almost seems along the same lines of all right, on the continuum, are we really talking about a reinforcer being reinforcing versus the aversiveness of not having the reinforcer and removing that as well? Like, are there other reinforcing pieces of using this tablet, which I have a long history of this being reinforcing? I watch videos, I do other things. Maybe then not having that could be a little bit more aversive, even though speech is functionally easier and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's like this item is now a conditioned stimulus. It's a preferred item, even though it's not directly related to its communication abilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got more future research here.
Yeah.
I asked a lot about the other procedures as well, because I've been on this kick lately. I've really been noticing with the multiple maintained behavior, even if we find the main function of the target behavior, and we are teaching replacement behavior to address that for reactive strategies, and we're dealing with caregivers that are there 24 hours, 7 days a week, and we can only be there an hour at a time. So right now we have to address all potential reinforcing outcomes, because just because it's a tangible maintain doesn't mean attention won't take over if you're still providing attention, but you're no longer giving the tangible item. But it sounds like you're able to kind of address and bypass some of those issues, at least where communication is necessary, and that is kind of the bigger issue there.
Yeah, I think it is really attributed to we have a pretty controlled setting, and a lot. It sounds like a little bit more, definitely more time with our patients too, so we can kind of spend the time to really make sure that the control is there.
Yeah, I will say that is one thing in our settings that I really miss and especially from being from the university, is being able to do the research versus our data is collected and we know it's not correct, but we just have to hope that the inconsistencies are consistent. You know what I mean? You're always giving us 60% of the picture, so at least we know that increase or decrease is still consistent, hopefully, in that sort of thing. So
I think like practice iterations of things is really what is the best reflection of our procedures. And that means there's a lot more mess to work through.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of manding, this cat is manding for my attention, so it's probably about time to wrap up.
I think before you do that, we need to see you bust out that guitar behind you. Just give us a quick
yeah.
riff real quick. And
No, it's gonna take a little bit of a little bit of an EO for me to do that, and right now that is not the case. So.
I think we still need to mention everybody that Kyle was a touring musician at some point, so we should hold him to this. I mean, he may not have been fed very well by being a touring musician, but he was touring at some point. So
fed well, paid well received. Yeah, all of no logical behavioral explanation for why I kept doing it, other than maybe the automatic reinforcement of just hearing myself play correct notes every now and then. Well, Alexandra and Cynthia, it's been such a pleasure having you guys on. Thank you for being here. Best of luck to all of your future endeavors, and thanks for joining Cooperant Learning today.
And
thank you so much.
If you're all going to be at ABAI, make sure you come get some free stuff from the table and say hi to us as well.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
No guitar there, I promise.
Bummer.